Welcome to Cultivate, a Veritas Academy podcast, where we explore truth, beauty, and goodness through meaningful conversation. We invite you to join us in discussions meant to edify your mind, encourage your heart, and equip your family to live abundantly in Christ.
Welcome back to Cultivate. I'm Ty Fischer, your host. I'm the head of school here at Veritas Academy, and I have with me today our Dean of Students and kind of the co-host of this podcast, Graham Dennis, and we're going to talk about one of those things that you're not supposed to talk about, right?
That's right.
At dinner, you're not supposed to talk about religion and politics. Now, I grew up in a family that's all we talked about at dinner. I don't know about you, Graham, but
that's a good family time.
yeah. We usually got together at Christmas and didn't talk again until the 4th of July. So, but we're going to be examining the political and what we're calling and what's called the pre-political, and thinking about how education, especially education of young people, is and needs to be somewhat pre-political. But Graham, first off, let's just talk about what we might mean by politics and what it's meant throughout history.
Yeah, being classically trained and loving Aristotle, I would say that Aristotle's use of the word political is very different than our use. It comes from the word polis, and it just means the life of the city. And it includes, as a subset, government. But when he's talking about political things, he's talking about things that pertain to the life of the city.
Well, and it's interesting that different cities had different...
That's right.
That they were trying to form different kinds of human beings.
That's right.
So in that way, their education was built, that paideia that we talk about, was built right into everything about the city.
Yes, and they had different constitutions and different forms of government that were probably flowing from the difference between their cultures.
Yeah.
And so what we mean by political is much more narrowly governmental. The process of electing, the process of lawmaking, and the things that we fight about that are related especially to elections and political parties. So, yeah.
So how has, or why has the political in our culture invaded even down into the early years of grammar school in some places? Why do you think that kind of flow of the politics into schools has happened?
I think a really interesting problem that emerges when you have a secular world is a question starts to emerge. What is your culture? Mm-hmm. What is it? So that's what Aristotle means by the political. He means what we would call culture. Mm-hmm. But what I think our founders thought in their conception of what we would think of loosely as a liberal state, is they thought that government would be pretty thin. The Constitution's a thin document.
Right, it is.
Then behind it, you'd have a thick culture.
Yeah.
So what we're calling the pre-political would be the thick culture that's going to inform a relatively thin Constitution.
Yeah, but what we have now, though, is not a thin...
Right, sorry, I didn't answer your question.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So the answer would seem to be something like civic religion, that secularism starts to become a thick culture.
Yeah.
And so what we think of as the thin procedural liberalism turns into what sometimes people call substantive liberalism, or the political starts to take the place of culture.
Yeah. So I was listening to a podcast last night, and they were talking about a school where the teachers basically got the kids all riled up, helped them make signs to go out and protest. And these were, middle school kids. And that just seems seems so foreign.
Yeah.
To what we're doing in education, that it was kind of, I've been not threatening, but I've been tempted to call up my legal counsel and just to say, hey, it seems now that the schools of our culture, even though they say they're secular, are really becoming more and more religious.
Yeah. And I think that's the answer to your question, Ty, is why have our schools been so politicized, or why have they become places where the political, which you would normally think of them as places of neutrality,
right.
Open public spaces in which there's a real viewpoint diversity. And what's happened is we see that's no longer the case.
Right. And we've had some really loud public school meeting school board meetings here recently.
Yes.
In Lancaster County. What kind of damage is that infusion of radical politics into the classroom? What kind of damage is that doing to students?
Yeah, I didn't fully answer the previous question, so hopefully in providing an answer to the previous question, I'll answer this question as well. I think the answer to the previous question is that at some point, what we might call thin procedural liberalism, there was a recognition that that doesn't actually advance your culture. It doesn't advance your country in the way that you want it to, so you need to thicken up your thin procedural liberalism. And this is what we call liberalism or progressivism, capital L. What I think happened in the schools is it was thought of as a secular way to motivate students in public spaces to achieve certain ends. So what's happening, I think, in our schools is we say there are private religious ends and we say there are these public secular ends, but increasingly those so-called public secular ends feel very religious.
Yes.
And it feels like the kinds of commitments that those ends entail are very similar to the kinds of commitments that you would find associated with Scripture, with the Ten Commandments, with the gospel, with the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah, and that doesn't just damage students. The whole educational environment gets pretty chilly at that point.
That's right.
So, and I know I know a little bit about your experience in college, and mine was similar in that was a time when intellectually my life really opened up.
Yes.
Right? I think it was for you as well.
Yes.
Some great teachers just brought me into understanding the world in a very different way. But it wasn't the way I understood it when I went to college.
That's right.
There was growth.
Yep.
But now we're in a culture where that kind of growth, or just to challenge someone's ideas, is very dangerous.
Yeah, I think I try to tell this to parents. What we experienced, some of us, I went to the University of South Carolina for my undergrad and did a philosophy degree, and then I went to Boston College for my graduate school. And it was an incredible experience because the university still had the ideal of viewpoint diversity. Now, it doesn't mean that, whether you were at Boston College, which is a Jesuit school, or the University of South Carolina, which of course is a state school.
A football school.
Yeah, football, right? And unfortunately not a very good one. But it doesn't mean that ideal is going to be executed in every single classroom and in, as the guiding political philosophy of the institution. But it obviously happened. My best professor, Rosamond Kent Sprague, Dr. Rosamond Kent Sprague, was a Plato professor, but she had an independent study in which we went to her house for tea and studied the Inklings. We studied Dorothy Sayers' Mind of the Maker. We studied, Lewis and Williams and Tolkien. And it was this same professor who was my Plato professor took us to her house, and this is at a state institution.
Yeah.
Those experiences are almost non-existent these days.
Yeah. What's that going to mean for our culture in the long run?
Yeah, and
maybe in the short run.
Yeah, I think the challenge we're facing is that to have one of the questions you just asked is what does this do to chill conversation, right? We want our students to be able to engage in probably the experience you had around the table, which is healthy debate,
right?
Fights, right? But salutary ones, where you're arguing about things, but you still love each other, and hopefully at the end of that disagreement, there's you're moving the needle in some direction. And what we want our students to be able to do is to enter into the culture with the capacity to argue, debate, converse winsomely.
Well, but that's one of the saddest things that I hear from our alumni sometimes, who are sometimes going off to schools and they're expecting the kind of debate and discussion that they've experienced here at Veritas to be, even amplified.
Yeah.
And what they find is keep your head down.
That's right.
Get your work done, get your degree. But that kind of discussion isn't happening.
Right.
Which really, in some ways, it seems like the price that we would pay for that not happening is fragility and immaturity in the long run for many adults.
Yeah, and the key virtue you need in a democracy, if are presupposing that we are supposed to have a democracy.
So is this a threat to democracy?
Yeah, right. I mean, how can you have a democracy in which there aren't public spaces in which to argue and debate and discuss things, right? That's the presupposition, is a democracy maximizes the opportunity for good debate and discussion.
And that's why a classical education is fitted to a democratic or a aristocratic republic kind of society.
That's right.
And this is something that we wrestle with here at Veritas, how can we have open discussions with people that we disagree with while holding on to our Christian commitments?
Yeah, the first thing you need is practice. So, sometimes our teachers have to role play, take on the opposing side. We read books, obviously, that profoundly disagree with the values upon which this institution is founded. And so the first thing is you got to practice.
Right.
And you have to learn winsomely to be able to engage not only someone who disagrees with you, someone who says that your viewpoint is nuts.
Yes.
Someone who says, I think what you believe is nuts. And you have to be able, in a sort of whatever time you have, let's say it's 5 minutes, explain why your viewpoint isn't nuts. And, that puts the onus on the other person to listen, to be thoughtful and reflective. But what I think I've found quite often is people are shocked that you're actually not nuts.
Yes. Well, and we look for opportunities to invite people in to talk with our oldest students who disagree vehemently with Christianity or with, biblical sexual ethic or, whatever. And it is, I've thought about this though, that maybe Veritas Academy is a sanctuary city for discussion, because I feel like we can bring them here and have a really good discussion, but there's a lot of that thickness of culture around what we're doing, whereas on social media or something like that, it just can't happen. And terribly in a lot of universities and colleges can't happen.
Yeah, I impossible for me to go through a podcast without mentioning Plato. But sometimes people miss about the
raisinets.
Right? Yes. What people sometimes miss about the Republic is that the conversation is taking place outside the city in the home of someone who's called a medic. His name is Cephalus, and that means he's a foreigner. But it's a safe place in which to have a conversation about political things. The dialogue is a conversation amongst a group of men about dangerous ideas. And you may have to do, this is a Rod Dreher idea, you may need to create a parallel polis. In other words, you may need to create or Václav Havel, ultimately. You may have to create a space within your polis, within your city, within your government, within your society, in which this is modeled. And we model it here. But we tell our students, don't expect this to be perfectly modeled elsewhere, but we have to start.
It's not going to be perfectly modeled here.
No, it's not going to be. Well, and we do have particular commitments. This is not a absolutely
it's not a values-free zone.
It's not
and the people that come in know our perspective.
Exactly. But we do need to practice dialogue, disagreement with, as 1 Peter famously says, be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks for the reason, the hope that you have, and do so with gentleness and respect. So that's what we have to help our students to practice.
So how can we as teachers, help our students to be able to push back against the kind of political posturing that happens all over politics? I mean, I think that in thinking about the universities, it's certainly not an equal left and right push there.
Yeah.
The left has kind of taken most of the universities, but how can we prepare students to have wisdom?
Yeah.
Right? And not I think about Justin Martyr, who was talking about martyrdom at one point, and he said that, he was mentioning that some would go out and seek martyrdom.
Right.
They would go like knock on the door and yell Jesus is Lord.
Right.
How can we help students be prepared to walk out into a culture that wants to cancel them, that doesn't want to talk? But of course, that kind of talking and discussion is one of the ways that we learn.
Yeah, one interesting thing that Dorothy Sayers, when she talks about the stages, the three stages of learning, the pull, hurt stage, the this argumentative stage that we see begin to develop around 8th grade. What we realize is you may have the desire, you may even have the capacity or the inclination, but it has to be realized through habit and practice. So one of the things that we have to do is we have to teach our students what it would look like to do this well and what it looks like to do it poorly. And they're actually going to do it poorly. I mean, they're going to flail and make mistakes. And, one of the things, nobody likes to lose. We all think of arguments as a fight.
Some of us like to lose even less than others.
Right. And sometimes when you don't want to lose, you stop fighting fairly. But it's not as though we should, lie to our families and make it seem as though the students who leave Veritas Academy are all absolutely perfect practitioners of the art of argument. I mean, we all struggle to do it well. And that's why we say at Thanksgiving, don't talk about religion and politics, because we know somebody's going to be angry.
Somebody's going to throw something.
Mashed potatoes might get thrown.
Yeah.
Or raisinets.
Yeah, raisinets. I hope you don't have raisinets at Thanksgiving dinner. So Christian schools, classical Christian schools, are generally conservative. And I mean that in, definitely in like a moral sense.
Right.
I want to hopefully say that in more of a, even a constitutional sense. Like we want to be, I want to do things that have worked before. I'm not looking to throw things over. I'm looking to cultivate.
Yeah.
So if we're conservative, why isn't that synonymous with classical Christian schools being like Republican?
Impossible for me to go through a podcast not quoting Plato or Edmund Burke. Okay, here's the Edmund Burke part. So I don't think conservative and Republican are synonymous.
No.
Right? So the party that represents conservative values will be further or closer to conservatism. But to, Russell Kirk way of thinking about this is conservatism is something that predates Republican.
Sure.
Right. So it's famously been described as a mood. And the mood is to desire to preserve the things that have been handed to us that are worth preserving. And of course, the chief thing that's worth preserving is truth. So conservatives are trying to preserve truth. Nobody thinks that the Republican Party is the repository of truth, but we think Christianity is.
Right.
So my call is as a conservative, is to conserve as much truth as I can. The other thing I'm trying to conserve is goodness.
Yes.
And I'm trying to conserve as much goodness. And the other thing is beauty. And I happen to think that being a Republican will help me to conserve more of that than being a Democrat. Regardless, though.
But at some time in history, it could be flip-flopped, right?
Sure. And what I would say is, and I guess I named my political affiliation on a podcast. So I am a registered Republican. But I think you don't have to be a registered Republican. I have a lot of friends who are conservatives, but not registered Republicans because they don't think the Republican Party conserves enough of what they want to conserve. And I think that's a really important position. So I happen to be, I would say for almost utilitarian reasons, connected to a political party, but I am not a Republican first. I'm way down the road. I'm first a Christian. I'm second a conservative.
A Burkean conservative.
Somewhere way down the road, I happen to have Republican affiliation.
Yeah. Now, Russell Kirk, he did a biography of Edmund Burke. I think it's free on Audible
read it.
right now.
It's wonderful.
Yeah. So I would just encourage people. Edmund Burke is just such a wonderful character who I think emulates some of the things that we as a classical school are trying to get at as we talk about being tradition affirming.
Right.
De Tocqueville does this as well. He talks about strange rules like township rules and the French Revolution wanted to like chop everything into squares, make it all rational.
Yeah.
And he's like, no, never give that up. Never give that up. Make the tradition the guide.
Yeah.
And
that means culture. That means culture, that what you're calling the pre-political, that what it means to be conservative is you're conserving a culture. And the political is just a tool. This is how our founders viewed it, to protect the culture you're trying to conserve.
Okay, I think I'm going to get you that. There's the third person I'm going to try to get you to quote here.
Okay,
I'll
here
tell
we
you,
go.
I'll tell you if you do. So first, let's just start. How can parents learn to savor the pre-political with their children?
I mean, one thing that we talk about sometimes, but maybe don't talk about enough, is I think that if you are living in a culture that's vibrant, you don't feel like you have to work hard. It's like what we feel about with creating work for our kids. You know, there was a time when it's pretty easy for your kids to have work. Now we feel like we have to work really hard to find ways.
We have to work
We have to
harder
work to get them to work. You know, you grew up, chopping wood and shoveling asphalt and gravel, and like that's something you did because it was just a natural part of
That's what we did.
your homestead.
Yeah.
So in the same way, when you live in a culture that is diminishing, you have to be more proactive in creating a culture in your home.
Yeah.
We already had a podcast on this, but for parents to think, I've got to actually proactively work towards the construction of a culture.
Well, and where I see Christians fall down on this sometimes is instead of, and I'm just going to use this as an example, they try to make everything have a moral lesson to it.
Right.
Instead of just enjoying good stories.
Let me see if I can guess who you're going to have me quote. Wendell Berry.
No.
Oh, okay.
Not actually Wendell Berry. So you got one strike now.
Sorry.
But
finish that point. That was an excellent point.
It's that every time, if what we're doing is just giving a backhanded moral lecture
right.
to our kids, we're going to starve their imagination. And eventually, the way that comes across, especially I think to boys, is it's like nagging them.
Yes.
And instead of enjoying reading Lord of the Rings, if it has them, like there's plenty of morality in Lord of the Rings, right?
That's right. Yeah.
But there's not a moral
right
to the Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
It's not like be a Gandalf, be a Daniel.
Which is why Tolkien said he doesn't like allegory. It doesn't mean that allegorical story. He just doesn't want to constantly be, everything has to have its allegorical, nagging, pointing finger.
Yeah. Yeah. The last thing I wanted to talk about was making space to enjoy the pre-political in Sabbath.
Yeah.
So why is Sabbath such an important time? And what kind of Sabbath should parents be attempting to enjoy with their children?
Yeah, the reason I mentioned Wendell Berry is I made a mistake. I said construct a culture. You can't, there's no such thing as constructing a culture.
Yeah.
Culture is something that's cultivated. And that's what the Sabbath theologically is suggesting, that the work has already 99.999% of the work has been done for us.
Uh-huh.
The Sabbath is resting in that finished work. Now, rest doesn't mean, it could have a negative connotation.
Mm-hmm.
You're exhausted, you fall down, and you sleep.
Sure.
Or it could have a positive connotation, which is God rested from his work. I always like to think God enjoyed the fruit of that work, so that he rested in the beauty of his creation. He gloried in the beauty of his creation. And it rests in a way as a kind of relationship.
Yeah.
It's resting in something. So I think that watching a film can be a form of rest. If you watch a great movie,
Going on a hike,
right? You're resting in something. You're not just moving away from work. You're actually moving towards something.
Yeah.
And we work so that we can rest in things.
So it goes away from the Little House on the Prairie Sabbath where everyone sits and does nothing,
right,
to a Sabbath where people are enjoying leisure.
Yes. And this means now this is Joseph Pieper.
Ding, 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 ding.
There we go. Leisure is the basis of culture. But Pieper argues that you can only have a civilization that is desirable if you have ritual. Mm-hmm. And so, for instance, you don't have to set the table. I mean, if you wanted, we could eat like dogs. We could just throw scraps of food in the middle of the room and we could all, it's probably what some of our houses that are full of boys look like.
That's not my house. That may be your house, maybe a little bit.
Yeah. No, yes, I have 4 boys. So dinner time, we have to construct a culture of civility.
Is there growling at dinner sometimes?
Definitely. Yeah, elbows and leaning over food too much. But we set the table. We don't have to set the table. And we think of rituals like Thanksgiving, for instance, in which there are foods that we eat, and not everyone's house has the same foods. And there's a kind of liturgy that goes with feasting.
Mm-hmm.
And when we look back on our lives, I think it's almost always the case that the things that we remember were those funny, idiosyncratic things that we did that just are not normal. They're out of the ordinary, but they take thought, and you have to cultivate them, and you do them year after year.
And if you do them year after year, you start to anticipate them.
That's right.
And that makes time sweeter and sweeter.
That's right.
So
yeah, like in Lewis, of course, his famous way of putting this is always winter and never Christmas.
Yeah.
Right. That's what our civilization is becoming. It's becoming always winter and never Christmas.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Graham, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this important topic. And it's just a blessing to think through how we as parents and teachers can help young people enjoy the pre-political.
Yeah. Thanks, Ty.
You've been listening to Cultivate, the podcast of Veritas Academy, a preschool through 12th grade classical Christian school in Leola, Pennsylvania. If you would like to learn more about Veritas, please visit veritasacademy.com to discover the truth, beauty, and goodness of classical Christian education.